It's a privilege to be here, and I'm especially glad to be back in Berlin. I was here in the middle of the 80s when I was Minister of Church and Education Affairs in Norway, in GGR. And my host, the Minister of Education in GGR at that time, was Madame Honecker, the wife of Erich Honecker. And so I very well remember 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, and I hosted a dinner for the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, not the European Council, but the Council of Europe, in the guest house of the government of Norway in Oslo. And we were sitting there, we got the message into the dining room that the Berlin Wall was falling. I will never forget that, 20 years ago. And so I came back here as Prime Minister, first in Bonn, visiting Helmut Kohl. And so the capital was moved to Berlin again, visiting Gerhard Schröder. So I have very strong feelings towards this beautiful city. I would like to share with you some thoughts on Norway's role in international peace efforts, and thereby reflect upon the opportunities and the challenges that a small nation may be facing in its pursuit of peace. And also talk about soft power. Not surprisingly, I shall argue that it is not the size, might, or sheer power of a nation that matters. It's a combination of factors, in addition to size and power in conventional sense, that are paramount in whether or not a nation can play a constructive role in peace efforts. That is, of course, not to say that a big and powerful nation cannot play a constructive role. Rather, it is to say that small and less powerful nations have something else to contribute than actors that are economically powerful or that control superior military means. I will also, however, suggest that what is the strength of a small nation may also become, and sometimes, its weakness. I come back to that. Let me mention a point of clarification here on my current role. I stepped down as Prime Minister in 2005. After almost 7 years in that position, I served in Parliament for 32 years. I think it was about the same as Bertie Ahern. And I left politics for good when I established the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights back in 2006. Hence, what I say here today, I say in my current capacity as founder and president of the Oslo Center, not on behalf of Norway. If you take a look at the long lines of Norway's history in international affairs, we can see a shift in the country's role, as perceived by ourselves as well as by others. The terrified peasants who watched the Norwegian Vikings raid villages and monasteries in what is France and Ireland today could hardly imagine that Norwegian men and women 1,000 years later would be perceived as a harmonious bunch with notable peace initiatives throughout the world. Their experience was another. Historically speaking, Norwegians are, of course, not more peace-loving than other peoples of the world. The Vikings gradually changed from banditry to trade, peacefully linked to the rest of Europe. Furthermore, Norway has no colonial past or hidden agendas. It has a long tradition of Christian missionaries offering health care and education to poor and oppressed people in developing countries. It has been a champion of parliamentary democracy throughout the 20th century, of female emancipation, and a sponsor of initiatives to promote peaceful solutions to conflicts. And this was also the country in which the great Swedish scientist and philanthropist Alfred Nobel entrusted the Nobel Peace Prize. And we don't really understand why he did it, but it was good. So therefore it's a focus on Oslo every December, 10th of December. Norway has also offered assistance to millions of refugees and displaced persons after World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The polar explorer, scientist, and diplomat Fridtjof Nansen, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922, organized food aid and health care to millions. He issued Nansen passports that allowed large-scale resettlement of refugees. And finally, he became the League of Nations' first commissioner for refugees. All these and more could be added, has contributed to giving Norway what you may call an image as a peace-loving country. It's of course a great honor, but it's also a heritage, an obligation, and an ideal that all Norwegian governments, irrespective of their political inclination, have strived to live up to and to develop further. It's against this background that I would like to share with you some reflections based on my own experience as Minister of Foreign Affairs and later Prime Minister of Norway over the period between 1989 and 2005. As a facilitator, Norway's role is to assist the parties in their efforts to reach a political solution to a given conflict, not to impose a solution on them. That's my point of entry. Norway has consequently become involved by invitation in the conflicts where we have been engaged. However, our sheer presence over long periods of time through development and NGO activities in a number of conflict-prone regions has made us a trusted and accessible partner for parties in conflict. Hence, presence and long-term commitments are keys to successful involvement in conflict resolution efforts. Presence and long-term commitment. It's not a question of just coming to a conflict-ridden country, call the parties to the table, impose a negotiation, and leave them again. That will always be a failure. You have to be invited, you have to be present, and you have to have a long-term commitment. The nature of our engagement has varied, and efforts have changed according to the dynamics and stages of the process. A significant part of our efforts have focused on promoting understanding and confidence between the parties. Without a minimum of confidence between the parties, you cannot succeed. Confidence building are three main factors. We have spent much time acting as a go-between, or as a channel of communication, helping the parties to find common ground between their respective positions. And another important challenge has been to ensure broad international support for processes Norway has been involved in. Because we are a small nation, and we need support from greater nations. So where has Norway been involved? During the past 10 years, Norway has been involved in various ways and to different degrees in peace and reconciliation processes in almost all parts of the world. In Asia, especially in Sri Lanka, but also in the Philippines, we are still there. In Africa, regarding the Ethiopian-Eritrea conflict, and in Sudan, come back to that. That's one of the successes. In Latin America, especially in Guatemala, which is also a success, and Colombo and Haiti. In the Middle East, in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and even in Europe, namely in Cyprus. Our involvement in Sri Lanka was well known and spanned many years from our first involvement, following the appointment of Norway's first special envoy to Sri Lanka, Mr. Erik Solheim, under my first government. He's now a member of government himself from a quite different party. Norway is small. Sadly enough, our efforts in Sri Lanka did not produce the results we have wanted, a peaceful solution to the conflict between the Tamil Tigers and the government. You all know how it ended, with a military solution. And I'm afraid we have not heard the last about the conflict in Sri Lanka. Because winning the war is one thing. Winning the peace is something quite different, and very often more difficult. There is no universal instruction manual for involvement in peace efforts. On the contrary, the history of Norway's involvement is a history of multifaceted efforts, flexibility, and multiple channels. Norway's role has been that of official facilitator of negotiations to sponsor or back channels for informal contact or negotiations, to actor in international coalitions promoting peace processes, supporter of the activities of others, to provider of humanitarian assistance and peace-building efforts. We have had different roles in different conflict-ridden countries. Given the manifold ways in which Norway has been involved, it is possible, out of our experience, to point to some factors that have been more important than others. It will not be the exhaustive, but let me try to sum up six of the factors I believe, out of our experience, have been crucial. The first is, I've already touched it, the willingness to make long-term commitments. Norway has a consistent and predictable policy of development assistance and peace efforts, based on solidarity and a long-term perspective. And there is a broad political consensus in Norway on foreign policy, which ensures consistency, regardless of changing governments. The second factor is pragmatism. Norway has also demonstrated a willingness to talk to all parties in the conflict. In that sense, we are pragmatic. In my view, you can hardly play a role if you don't talk to all. There is sometimes political pressure to stay away from some of the parties in the conflict. Hamas in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or Taliban in Afghanistan may be examples. However, the saying that you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends, points to a simple but important truth. Hence, you have to make yourselves accessible to dialogue with all parties. You have to be pragmatic. The third factor is to possess, namely flexible and ample resources. Norway makes both financial and human resources available for peace and reconciliation processes. These resources are ample and flexible, enabling Norway to become engaged quickly, not without a very, very long process. Coupled with a substantial engagement in development cooperation, we do not only support the negotiation process as such, but engage in monitoring peace agreements and actively designed our development cooperation so that it helps the implementation of peace agreements and prevent the re-emergence of conflicts. That's, for instance, the case in Sudan, in the conflict between South and North. Norway was a facilitator for the peace, together with the US. And now we are monitoring the peace between North and South. And we are also heavily involved with development cooperation in Sudan. A fourth precondition is to maintain. To maintain. Close cooperation with Norwegian and NGOs. In many instances, Norwegian or international NGOs have been our point of entry into peace and reconciliation processes. The extensive networks that Norwegian and international NGOs have built through decades of humanitarian assistance and development cooperation have given us access to areas where official Norway has little or no presence. I believe there is such a thing as a Nordic model. And one thing that characterizes this Nordic model is a very close cooperation with and generous government funding of development and humanitarian NGOs that are given the resource to build lasting capacity and presence on the ground. Their presence and the confidence that local communities and leaders have in them has been instrumental in government involvement in various peace efforts. Let me mention two examples. Sudan and the so-called Naivasha process. That, as I already mentioned, led successfully to the signing of a comprehensive peace agreement, is a case in point. It could hardly have happened without the groundwork of Norwegian NGOs in Sudan. And they got confidence to both parties. I remember this very well, because the peace agreement was signed in January 2005. I was still the Prime Minister. They negotiated over many years. But it started, especially with two Norwegian NGOs, working both in south and north of Sudan. Another example is Guatemala, which I also remember very well, because the first peace talks between the guerrilla and the government took place in Norway when I was foreign minister in 1990. And it was largely successful. It ended up with a peace agreement 6 years later. But it was a Norwegian NGO, the Norwegian Church Aid, which paved the way for the government's involvement. It had never happened, in my view, without. A fifth precondition for involvement is to maintain, namely, good relations with central international actors. Norway, as you know, is a member of NATO, not of EU. We have good relations with the US, as well as with other major actors, such as the European Union, Japan, neighboring country Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Big powers in the world of today. These relations are necessary for us to be trustworthy in peace negotiations and for getting major international actors with considerable leverage on board at one point or another in the process. We need them, because Norway is so small. Norway's position as a major contributor to the UN and extensive development cooperation also gives us credibility in the international community. And so the sixth favorable precondition for Norway to be involved in peace process is impartiality. Impartiality. Norway has, as I mentioned earlier, no colonial past. And we do obviously not have any, shall we say, superpower ambitions. I think all are aware of that. They are not afraid of Norway, fortunately. So I think I can say that Norway's commitment to peacemaking is perceived sincere, with not a hidden agenda, not driven by ulterior political or economic motives. These are the 6 major factors for succeeding in peace efforts, which I have drawn from the Norwegian experience. Norway has a mixed legacy when it comes to peace efforts. I want to underscore that successes in this area is rather seldom, if ever, the result of one actor alone. It's all about carefully calibrated and long-term partnership and cooperation. In the same way, as the successes. The failures are also the result of the doings of more than one actor. If I was to highlight some critical factors or conditions, I would mention clarity about why and on what terms we get involved in peacemaking, and clarity about competence and analytic capacity. First of all, you need to have the necessary advantages, the political and cultural capital, and the personal relations for getting involved. But being a player should never be a goal in itself. That has more to do with political and diplomatic vanity. You need good answers to why we should go and be involved, and what makes it likely that you will achieve anything. In other words, answers to what Norway's or any other country's comparative advantages are in a given conflict situation. You have to have good answers to these questions. If you don't have, you shall not start. Why should Norway be involved? What terms should we follow? What is our competence and advantage? One comparative advantage can be the simple fact that one has been invited by the parties. It's simple, but quite fundamental. Supply-driven peace diplomacy is seldom successful, as a suspicion of ulterior motives is ever present. As I have already mentioned, small countries without colonial histories or geostrategic interests may be less likely to arouse suspicion by parties than former colonial parties or countries with stated interests in the region. That's an advantage for Norway. At the same time, small countries with few interests in the region and no colonial past may, for exactly those reasons, be seen as less favorably positioned than countries with a history in the region, and to be lacking in competence. Competence that is often linked to long lines of history. But I believe that Norway mainly has benefited from its absence of history and geostrategic interests in conflict regions where we have been involved in peace efforts. But I also believe that there are downsides to innocence, countries like Norway, such as a limited experience and understanding of political culture in the region or country in question. Soft power may be synonymous with knowledge and cultural competence, or at least knowledge and cultural competence are fundamentally important components of soft power. Such competence does not come by itself. It must be developed and put to active use in peace diplomacy. Small countries and provincialism hang together. And provincialism, in my view, is a challenge for small countries that engage in peace diplomacy. It must be countered. At the bottom of this is the realization that you need to have the analysis right. Your involvement is only as good as your analysis. Your involvement needs to be knowledge-based. Your involvement needs to draw upon the best available competence and to be open to scrutiny by experts. This is critical, but difficult. The closed circles and tight information control that characterize peace diplomacy is one reason why this is a challenge. A small country with a limited competent base and research capacity must draw upon international expertise, available either in the Foreign Service or in research institutions. We need partners. The need for discretion and secrecy in certain stages of peace processes is understandable, but it must be balanced against the danger of referential universes where actors, countries, and individuals are driven by the urge to be a player, and where critical views are easily seen as sand in the diplomatic and political machinery, or worse, written off as irrelevant. You must accept criticism. It can help you in the process. Looking back at my time as a politician and head of government, I can easily see how and why it happens that being a player may become a goal in itself. For politicians, as well as for the foreign service that is there to serve the politicians and their needs for successes in foreign policy. That is why I end my speech with this point, stressing the need for careful calibration based on sensitive analysis and the best available competence. Without, a small country like Norway has no chance to succeed in peace efforts. So let me conclude. The modern Norwegian Vikings, I'm one of them, is committed to search for peace. Norway is a small country, but with a rather strong engagement for development, for peace and human rights in different parts of the world. We have been endowed with natural resources and a very strong economy, and the country is not small in financial terms, neither in geographical terms. If you switch Norway around our southern point, down on the map to the south, the northern point will come down to Rome in Italy. So in geographical terms, a huge country. Rather than rehearsing the favorite phrase of Norway being a small country, a predecessor of me, a former Prime Minister of Norway from the same Christian Democratic Party as me, he started his speech on foreign policy in the parliament many years ago by saying Norway is a small country in the world. And people were a little bit laughing. That was a very simple sentence. But it's very true. Think about it. But rather than rehearsing this phrase, I would like to end with a phrase coined by our current foreign minister, Mr. Støre, who would rather see, as he says, Norway as a country in a small world. And that is the truth today. We are all countries in a small world. I believe this is his right. It is a connectivity or interconnectedness of our time, where nations large and small play complementary roles that make it imperative for us to act and to get involved, and which demands multilateralism rather than unilateralism. It's not a matter of size or power in the conventional sense. It's a question of commitment, partnership, and cooperation based on complementary roles, capacities, and competencies, and the realization that we are all in it together. And of course, it's also a question of political will. A will to make a difference, a will to get involved, a will to take risks, and to seize an opportunity when it presents itself. So good luck in your efforts, and thank you for your attention.